There's a moment, quiet, deliberate, unsettling, when you stop chasing. You stop explaining, stop trying to make them understand, stop filling the silence they created. And that silence? It's louder than any argument you've ever had. Avoidantly attached individuals live in emotional control. Distance is their safety. Withdrawal is their language. They pull away not always to hurt you, but to protect themselves from vulnerability, from dependency, from the terror of being needed. They count on your reaction, on your texts that arrive anyway, on your attempts to reopen what they've closed. It confirms what they unconsciously believe, that they can retreat and you'll still be there. But then you go silent. No pleading, no passive-aggressive remarks, no long messages explaining how you feel. Just silence. And suddenly, the avoidance system, built on predictable reactions, loses its balance. They expected control. What they get instead is uncertainty. At first, they'll rationalize it. They're just busy. They'll text eventually. But time stretches differently in the avoidant mind. Each hour of your absence feels like an echo they didn't prepare for. Because silence is the one thing they can't manage. It mirrors their own emptiness. It forces them to face what they've been running from, the fact that they do care. And that realization doesn't arrive gently. It comes with confusion, restlessness, even irritation. You've disrupted their emotional equation. They built distance to feel safe, but your silence turns that distance into something else, isolation. And isolation isn't safety, it's exposure. They start to wonder, did I push too far? They won't say it. But internally, the narrative begins to shift. That's the paradox of silence with an avoidant. What once was your punishment becomes their mirror. You stop reaching out, and suddenly, they're the one replaying moments, overthinking messages, feeling the sting of their own withdrawal. Your silence becomes a language they never learned to read. If you want to better understand how to deal with avoidance, then subscribe to the channel to know everything. Silence does something that words never could. It triggers the avoidant's deepest, most guarded fear, emotional loss disguised as freedom. At first, they think they're fine. They tell themselves they needed space, that things were getting too intense, that you were just another person who demanded too much. They rely on detachment to reset. But the truth is, avoidants don't do well with emotional vacuums. They expect pursuit, not peace. And when the usual script breaks, when you don't come knocking, their self-protective distance begins to feel like abandonment. That's the irony. They fear being consumed by closeness. Yet your silence exposes how much they've relied on your presence to feel secure in their independence. You were the proof that they were desired. Your consistency fed their quiet ego. When you stop reaching out, you don't just disappear. You take away the reflection they use to confirm their worth. And without it, they start to unravel. Their mind begins to oscillate between pride and panic. One part says, "Good, I needed this break." The other whispers, "Why haven't they reached out? Did I go too far?" That inner tension grows. They might distract themselves, bury the thought of you under work, friends, or casual connections, but the silence doesn't fade. It lingers. It questions them in ways you never could. Because silence is not indifference. It's presence turned inward. It's the sound of boundaries finally speaking. And for someone who controls closeness by withdrawing first, losing that control feels unbearable. They start to remember your warmth, your tone, the small ways you cared. But now those memories are filtered through the discomfort of not being able to fix it without facing what they fear most, vulnerability. Avoidants often mistake emotional safety for emotional distance. But when silence enters the picture, that illusion collapses. The quiet shows them something terrifyingly simple. Connection isn't guaranteed. People who care can also leave. And it's in that realization, unspoken, uncomfortable, that their detachment begins to crack. Something subtle changes the moment you go silent. For the first time, the avoidant is no longer in control of the emotional rhythm. The dynamic flips, quietly but powerfully. The one who used to retreat and dictate the pace of connection suddenly becomes the one waiting, wondering, replaying. Avoidants are used to leading the dance of distance. They decide when to pull away, when to return, when to offer crumbs of warmth to keep the connection alive but manageable. It's not about cruelty, it's about safety. They maintain control by controlling proximity. But silence takes that away. Your absence creates a void that no one else can fill, because it's not just your attention they miss. It's the predictability of your energy. You see, avoidants are more dependent on consistency than they realize. They need to know you're still there to justify their own retreat. It allows them to withdraw without real loss. But now, the equation has changed. You've stopped feeding the cycle. There's no reassurance waiting at the end of their distance. And suddenly, the control they used to find comfort in feels like exposure. They're no longer managing the relationship, they're reacting to it. The silence starts to echo as uncertainty. Questions arise that they can't silence. Are they done with me? Did I misread how much they cared? Were they ever truly attached? Or did they finally see through me? And that's when the emotional tide turns. Because while you were once the one overanalyzing their every move, they now step into that same space, quietly obsessed with understanding yours. They might check your social media, scroll through old messages, or rehearse conversations they never had the courage to finish. Not because they've suddenly become secure, but because silence stripped away their illusion of control. For an avoidant, losing emotional control feels like losing identity. And when that control is taken by someone they thought would always stay, it stirs something deeper than attraction. It stirs fear. The fear of being forgotten, of realizing that their detachment didn't make them powerful, it made them replaceable. And that realization is the beginning of awakening or self-sabotage. When silence stretches long enough, it stops being comfortable for the avoidant. What once felt like control starts to sting like loss. And because they don't know how to sit with that feeling, they often do what they've always done, find distraction. This is the phase where the avoidant starts to rebound emotionally. Not necessarily by rushing into another relationship, but by grasping for anything that restores their sense of control. They might become unusually social, dive into work, post more often, flirt casually, or bury themselves in hobbies. On the surface, it looks like indifference, but underneath, it's a quiet panic disguised as self-sufficiency. You see, avoidants aren't as emotionally detached as they appear. They feel deeply, but their coping mechanism is to manage those feelings instead of experiencing them. So, when you go silent and they feel the space you've left behind, they try to patch that space with activity. They need proof that they're still unaffected, still independent, still unbothered. But here's what really happens. The more they distract themselves, the more your silence follows them into every quiet moment. When they stop scrolling, when the night falls, when there's no one left to impress, that's when the truth catches up. Your silence becomes the ghost they can't shake off. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped trying to convince them. Avoidants are addicted to control, not connection. But your silence dismantles that addiction. It forces them to feel the unpredictability they've always feared, the rawness of not knowing where they stand. And though they might reach for new people or new routines, the emptiness underneath doesn't go away. It only grows more visible. This is when you often see mixed signals resurface. A random text. Just checking in. A memory shared as if no distance ever existed. It's not love in its purest form. It's fear of invisibility. Your silence has reminded them of something they've long denied. That emotional avoidance doesn't protect them from loss. It guarantees it. And so, without realizing it, the avoidant begins to circle back. Not because you called them, but because silence did. It often happens quietly. No apology. No confession. Just a message that slips into your notifications as if nothing ever happened. Hey, how have you been? This is the moment the avoidant returns. Not because they've had a revelation, But because the silence has done something they didn't expect, it lingered. It became real. It stopped being a tactic and turned into a truth. You weren't waiting. The return of an avoidant is rarely about closure. It's about curiosity mixed with fear. They want to know if the door is still open, if the rhythm they controlled can be restored. They may tell themselves they just want to check in, but what they're really searching for is confirmation that they still matter, that they can still come back and feel safe in the same pattern of emotional control. When they text, it's rarely impulsive. They've thought about it for days. They've replayed conversations, stalked your social media, noticed your absence more than they'll ever admit. The message they send carries all the unspoken questions they're too afraid to ask. Do you still care? Did I lose you? Were you ever mine to begin with? If you respond warmly, they relax momentarily. The equilibrium returns. But if your reply is neutral, detached, or, worse, absent, they feel something new. A discomfort that doesn't go away with distance. It's not rejection that hurts them, it's powerlessness. For the first time, their usual strategy has failed to reset the connection. Avoidants are drawn to what they can't control, and your silence gave them that exact experience. It mirrored their own patterns back to them, but without the emotional chaos they expected. You didn't beg, argue, or collapse into sadness. You just let go. And that emotional stillness is devastating to someone who survives on avoidance. When the avoidant returns, it's not always to rebuild the relationship, it's to soothe their own anxiety, to prove they still have access to your energy. Whether you choose to respond or not, understand this. Their message isn't about you missing them. It's about them missing who they were when you cared. And yet, beneath that need for reassurance lies something fragile, something almost humanizing. Because your silence didn't just trigger fear of loss, it awakened the possibility of longing. Something begins to shift when the avoidant realizes your silence isn't a performance, it's peace. It's not about punishing them, not about winning. It's simply your decision to no longer participate in a dynamic that drained you. And that realization pierces through their usual defenses in ways nothing else could. At first, their longing is disguised as curiosity. They wonder how you've been, what you're doing, whether someone else now occupies the space they once kept half empty. But beneath that curiosity is discomfort, an emotional stirring that feels foreign to them. Avoidants aren't used to missing people, they're used to managing them. Your absence, however, doesn't leave them feeling free, it leaves them feeling seen. Because silence exposes what they refuse to admit. They did care. Avoidants often avoid themselves most of all. Their distance from others mirrors the distance they keep from their own feelings. But your silence creates a mirror they can't escape. It shows them the pattern, the push, the pull, the exits they always take when intimacy grows too close. And now, without you reacting, they can finally see what that pattern cost them. Longing, for them, isn't romantic. It's intrusive. It interrupts the illusion of control. They may catch themselves checking their phone too often, scanning for signs of your presence, even revisiting memories that used to feel like burdens. The very things that once triggered their withdrawal now become the things they crave. Your steadiness, your softness, your presence. This is the early stage of awareness, the quiet dawning that avoidance doesn't protect them from pain, it just delays it. Because no amount of emotional distance can erase the imprint of someone who met them with understanding and then chose silence over self-betrayal. Still, awareness doesn't equal transformation. Many avoidants will sit in this realization like a locked room, feeling everything, saying nothing. They won't reach out right away because they're not ready to face the part of themselves that broke something good. But the longing stays. It lingers not as desire, but as recognition. They lost not just a person, but a chance to feel safe in love. And for someone who's built their life on avoiding exactly that kind of safety, the quiet is deafening. This is where the battle truly begins, not between you and the avoidant, but within them. Your silence has turned into a mirror, And what they see in it isn't just you. It's themselves. Avoidants spend much of their emotional life avoiding contradiction. They tell themselves stories that keep them safe. I don't need closeness. I'm better alone. Love complicates things. But when you step away without drama, those stories start to unravel. Because now they're left with the one thing they can't explain away, why they still care. Inside the avoidant, two selves start to argue. One says, stay away, it's safer. The other whispers, but what if they were different? This tug of war is exhausting. You've triggered a part of them they've buried for years. The part that actually wants connection, that wants to trust, that longs for home. But for the avoidant, longing feels like weakness. Wanting someone feels like surrender. And so they fight it. They'll try to reassert control. Maybe they'll convince themselves you weren't that important. Maybe they'll date someone new to prove the point. But no matter what they do, the silence remains. A constant reminder that you no longer orbit around their avoidance. It's not rejection that haunts them. It's irrelevance. Avoidants build their safety on emotional predictability. But your silence made you unpredictable, untouchable. And that loss of control forces them to feel something they've spent a lifetime numbing: regret. Not the kind that leads to grand apologies or romantic confessions, but the quiet ache that follows realization. The knowledge that they pushed away something they weren't ready to receive. The conflict deepens because they can't win this one. If they reach out, they risk rejection. If they stay silent, they remain haunted. Either way, they have to feel, and that's their greatest discomfort. For you, this phase often goes unseen. You may think they've moved on. You may even believe your silence meant nothing. But behind that calm exterior, the avoidant is unraveling slowly, privately, in ways you'll never witness. Because for the first time, they're not running from you. They're running from the part of themselves that finally realizes what they lost. For the avoidant, control is oxygen. It's not just how they navigate relationships, it's how they survive them. Every withdrawal, every carefully timed text, every moment of distance is designed to maintain that fragile sense of emotional safety. Control keeps their fears contained, their heart protected, their vulnerability unseen. But your silence has exposed something terrifying. That control was never real. At first, they believed they were the ones setting the terms. They thought their detachment gave them power, that by pulling away, they could decide when connection happened and when it ended. But when you stopped chasing, that illusion cracked. The control they prided themselves on depended entirely on your willingness to keep reaching out. Once you stopped, the structure collapsed. Now, the avoidant begins to feel what they've avoided all along: helplessness. It's subtle at first, a quiet unease that follows them throughout the day. But it grows, because control without connection is emptiness. And your silence made that emptiness impossible to ignore. They might tell themselves they're fine, that distance is familiar, even comforting. But beneath that calm exterior, something restless stirs. The absence of your energy creates a void they can't fill with distractions anymore. The illusion that they were always the one in charge begins to crumble under the weight of reality. It was never about dominance. It was always about fear. Avoidants equate love with loss of freedom. But your silence teaches them something new: that real freedom isn't found in isolation, but in emotional safety. And that kind of safety only exists when control isn't necessary. For some, this realization brings humility. For others, it sparks denial. They may lash out internally, blame you for detaching, accuse you in their mind of giving up too soon. Because admitting that your silence broke their illusion feels unbearable. It means they were never as detached as they pretended. It means that somewhere deep down, they wanted to be chosen, but refused to choose in return. And that truth sits heavy. Because what they're really confronting isn't just the loss of you. It's the loss of the identity they built to protect themselves. The illusion has shattered. What remains is raw, unfiltered awareness. They were never in control of the connection, only of their own avoidance. There comes a moment, quiet, unspectacular, but piercing when the avoidant finally understands what your silence really meant. It wasn't anger. It wasn't punishment. It was peace. It was the moment you decided to stop translating love through effort and started protecting your own energy. And in that moment, something cracks inside them. The defenses that once felt like strength now look like loneliness. The walls that once protected them now feel like cages. They begin to see how their need for control wasn't about power at all. It was about fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being rejected. Fear of needing someone they couldn't predict. They think back to the moments they pulled away when you were soft with them. The messages they ignored. The times you reached out, only to be met with silence. It plays like a quiet montage of missed chances, and this time, they can't justify it. Your silence made them confront something no argument ever could. That connection requires risk, and that they never took it. For the first time, the avoidant sees love not as pressure, but as presence. They realize that what scared them wasn't your closeness. It was their own capacity to care. You didn't overwhelm them. They overwhelmed themselves trying to avoid being vulnerable. And that recognition hits differently when you're gone. This is where avoidance transforms into awareness, where the emotional pattern starts to show its cost. They see how every escape led to emptiness, how every retreat was just a rehearsal for loss. And in that understanding lies the seed of change, not for your relationship, perhaps, but for them. Because true realization doesn't come from losing someone you didn't care about. It comes from losing someone who showed you what care actually felt like. Now, the avoidance sits with the weight of that truth. They won't say it aloud, but they know your silence wasn't rejection. It was reflection. It showed them the gap between the love they crave and the fear that keeps them from receiving it. And that realization, quiet, painful, human, is the first step toward healing. Silence, when it finally settles, becomes a teacher for both. For the avoidant, it dismantles illusion. For you, it restores power. It shows each side something they couldn't see while caught in the cycle. One was running, the other reaching. Now both are still. For the avoidant, your silence reveals what all the distance in the world couldn't hide. That control isn't love, and solitude isn't peace when it's built on fear. They begin to feel the quiet differently. Not as freedom, but as consequence. They see that every withdrawal had a cost, that every unanswered message wasn't strength, but avoidance disguised as self-preservation. And when the silence stretches long enough, it becomes undeniable. They pushed away what they secretly wanted to keep. But silence teaches you, too. It teaches that loving someone doesn't mean shrinking for them. That care without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. You learn that walking away isn't cruelty, it's clarity. It's the moment you stop trying to rescue someone from the very walls they built to stay untouched. You start to see that peace isn't found in closure from them. It's found in coming home to yourself. The quiet that once felt heavy becomes grounding. You're no longer waiting for their awareness, their apology, or their return. You've reclaimed your presence, your energy, your worth. And maybe, someday, the avoidant will understand that your silence wasn't an ending. It was an invitation to grow. Because the truth is, silence doesn't destroy connection. It reveals its real strength. If the bond was built on control, it will dissolve. If it was built on respect, it will transform. But either way, silence breaks the pattern. It heals what words could never fix. So, if you find yourself here, holding space, not chasing, not explaining, know that you're not being cold. You're being clear. You've simply chosen self-respect over repetition. And for the avoidant, that choice might be the most unforgettable sound of all. If this spoke to you, share your story in the comments, subscribe for more, and let others know silence can speak louder than any goodbye.